The smell of motor oil and metal shavings had become as familiar to Sarah Chen as her morning coffee. For 15 years, she'd run Chun's motor repair from the same weathered building on the outskirts of Millbrook, Texas, a town so small that everyone knew everyone, and strangers were noticed before they even parked their cars. Sarah had built her reputation one engine at a time, fixing everything from lawn mowers to motorcycle engines, earning the trust of farmers, mechanics, and weekend warriors who needed someone who could make the impossible possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah wasn't your typical small-town mechanic. At 38, she possessed an almost supernatural ability to diagnose problems that left other mechanics scratching their heads. Her shop was cluttered with half-finished projects, spare parts organized in a system that made sense only to her, and tools that had been worn smooth by years of use. The locals called her the Motor Whisperer, because she seemed to understand engines in a way that went beyond technical knowledge. It was as if she could feel what was wrong just by listening to the rhythm of a struggling motor. Her journey to becoming Millbrook's most trusted mechanic hadn't been straightforward. Sarah had grown up in San Francisco, the daughter of immigrants who ran a small electronics repair shop in Chinatown. Her father had taught her that every machine had a heartbeat, a rhythm that would tell you everything you needed to know if you just knew how to listen. When she was 12, she'd fixed her first motor, a broken blender that her mother had given up on. By the time she was 16, she was rebuilding motorcycle engines in the family garage. Much to her parents' bewilderment, college had been a brief detour into mechanical engineering, but Sarah found the theoretical approach stifling. She learned more in her father's shop in a single afternoon than in weeks of lectures about thermodynamics and materials science. After 2 years, she dropped out and spent the next few years working in various repair shops across California, absorbing knowledge from old-timers who'd been fixing engines since before she was born. The move to Texas had been motivated by heartbreak and a desire for a fresh start. Sarah had followed a boyfriend to Austin, but when that relationship imploded, she'd found herself stranded in a state she'd never intended to call home. Instead of running back to California, she'd bought a beat-up truck with her savings and driven until she ran out of gas in Millbrook. The owner of the local diner had mentioned that the town's only mechanic had recently retired, and suddenly Sarah saw an opportunity. With a loan that required her to put up everything she owned as collateral, Sarah had purchased the old Sinclair station on the edge of town. The building was a relic from the 1950s, complete with original signage and a hydraulic lift that groaned ominously every time she used it. But it had good bones, plenty of space, and most importantly, it was hers. First few years had been brutal. Small-town folk were naturally suspicious of outsiders, especially a young Asian woman who claimed she could fix their precious trucks and tractors better than old Pete Morrison had for 30 years. Sarah had to prove herself one job at a time, often working for barely enough to cover her expenses just to build her reputation. She'd take on the jobs that other mechanics wouldn't touch, the engines that had been declared hopeless, the vintage machines that required parts that hadn't been manufactured in decades. Her breakthrough had come during her 3rd year in Millbrook, when the high school's prized 1967 Mustang, the one used for homecoming parades and football game celebrations, had suffered what the dealer called a catastrophic engine failure. The school board was ready to sell it for scrap when Sarah volunteered to take a look. She'd spent 3 weeks rebuilding the engine from the ground up, fabricating parts that couldn't be found anywhere, and when that Mustang roared to life again, the entire town had taken notice. Word spread beyond Millbrook's borders. Sarah began getting calls from collectors, racing enthusiasts, and mechanics from other towns who had customers with impossible problems. Her shop became known as the place where dead engines came back to life, where vintage machines were restored to better than original. condition, and where the phrase "can't be fixed" simply didn't exist. But success brought its own challenges. As her reputation grew, so did the complexity of the problems people brought her. She was working 12-hour days, 7 days a week, turning down jobs because she simply couldn't keep up with demand. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd found exactly what she'd been looking for in life, but she was too busy to enjoy it. Sarah had developed systems and shortcuts that allowed her to work faster without sacrificing quality. She could tear down an engine in half the time it took most mechanics, and her diagnostic skills had become legendary. Customers would drive hundreds of miles just to have her listen to their engine and tell them what was wrong. By her 15th year in business, Sarah had settled into a comfortable routine. She knew every sound her building made, every customer's preferences, and every shortcut between her shop and the parts stores in the surrounding towns. She had a handful of regular helpers, local kids who wanted to learn about engines, and older men who enjoyed the camaraderie of the shop but the serious work, the real problem-solving. That was all Sarah. That's why the events of that Tuesday morning in March would shake her to her core and reveal that her quiet life in small-town Texas was about to become anything but ordinary. Tuesday had started like any other day at Chen's Motor Repair. Sarah arrived at 6:30, an hour before she officially opened, to enjoy the quiet solitude of her shop before the day's chaos began. She'd made coffee in the ancient percolator that had come with the building and was reviewing the day's schedule when she heard the first vehicle pull into her gravel parking lot. That was unusual. Her first appointment wasn't until 8, and most of her regular customers knew better than to show up early unless it was a genuine emergency. Sarah peered through the grimy window of her office and felt her stomach tighten with an unfamiliar anxiety. 3 black SUVs had arranged themselves in her parking lot with military precision, blocking both entrances to her property. The vehicles were pristine, too clean for Texas back roads, with tinted windows and government plates that Sarah couldn't quite make out from her vantage point. She'd lived in small towns long enough to know that this kind of attention usually meant trouble, and she quickly ran through a mental inventory of anything she might have done wrong. Her taxes were current, her business license was up to date, and she'd never had so much as a parking ticket. The doors of the SUVs opened simultaneously, and 6 men emerged wearing identical black tactical pants and unmarked polo shirts. They moved with the fluid coordination of a team that had worked together for years, spreading out to cover the perimeter of her shop while maintaining clear sight lines to each other. Sarah's military knowledge was limited to what she'd seen in movies, but these men radiated the kind of professional competence that made her instinctively step back from the window. The apparent leader of the group approached her front door, a man in his 40s with salt and pepper hair, intense eyes, and the kind of bearing that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed without question. He knocked on her door with 3 sharp raps, then stepped back and waited with his hands clasped behind his back. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities as she walked to the door. Federal agents investigating some kind of fraud? Immigration? Officials checking her documentation? Environmental inspectors concerned about her waste disposal practices? None of it made sense, but she couldn't think of any reason why she'd warrant this level of official attention. She opened the door to find herself looking up at the leader, who was easily 6 inches taller than her 5'4" frame. Up close, she could see the small scars on his hands and face that spoke of a life spent in dangerous places, and the way his eyes constantly moved, cataloging every detail of her shop and surroundings. "Miss Chen," he said, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders. "I'm Colonel Matthews. I need to speak with you about your work." "My work?" Sarah managed, trying to keep her voice steady. "I fix motors. Lawn mowers. Motorcycles, farm equipment. Nothing that should interest." She gestured vaguely at the assembled team. "May we come in?" Colonel Matthews asked, though something in his tone suggested it wasn't really a question. Sarah stepped aside, and the colonel entered her shop, followed by 2 of his men. The others remained outside, maintaining their defensive positions. Sarah noticed that they all wore earpieces and that their eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning for threats that she couldn't imagine existed in her quiet corner of Texas. Inside her shop, Colonel Matthews looked around with obvious interest, taking in the organized chaos of her workspace. His gaze lingered on a partially disassembled vintage Harley-Davidson engine that she'd been rebuilding for a customer in Austin, then moved to the collection of diagnostic equipment that represented 15 years of careful investment in her craft. "Impressive operation," he said, running his hand along the edge of her primary workbench. "We've been watching your work for some time, Miss Chen. Your reputation extends well beyond Millbrook." "Watching my work?" Sarah echoed, confusion mixing with growing alarm. "Why would anyone be watching me fix lawn mowers?" Colonel Matthews exchanged a glance with one of his companions, a younger man with the kind of military haircut that suggested he took regulations very seriously. "Miss Chen, are you familiar with the term dual-use technology?" Sarah shook her head, though something about the phrase made her uncomfortable. "It refers to technology that has both civilian and military applications," the colonel explained. "A GPS system, for example, can help someone navigate to the grocery store, or it can guide a precision munition to its target. The same skills that allow you to rebuild a motorcycle engine can be applied to ... other types of motors." The pieces began falling into place in Sarah's mind, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air flowing through her. "Open bay doors. You're talking about weapons." "We're talking about national security," Colonel Matthews corrected gently. 3 weeks ago, our intelligence services intercepted communications, suggesting that certain individuals with hostile intentions toward the United States were seeking someone with very specific technical skills. Someone who could modify small engines for ... alternative purposes. Sarah's mouth went dry. "And you think that someone is me?" "We think that someone might approach you," the colonel said. "Your reputation for solving impossible problems, your willingness to work on unusual projects, your location in a small town where strangers would be noticed, all of these factors make you a person of interest." The weight of what he was saying settled over Sarah like a heavy blanket. Her quiet life, her simple business, her reputation for fixing the unfixable, all of it had somehow painted a target on her back that she never could have imagined. Sarah sank onto the stool beside her workbench, her mind struggling to process what Colonel Matthews was telling her. The familiar surroundings of her shop, the tools she knew by touch, the smell of oil and metal that had become her comfort zone, suddenly felt foreign and threatening. "I don't understand," she said finally. "What kind of modifications are we talking about? And why would anyone think I'd be involved in something like that?" Colonel Matthews pulled a tablet from his jacket and handed it to her. The screen displayed a series of photographs showing small motors that had been modified in ways that made Sarah's stomach turn. What should have been simple engines for model airplanes and remote-controlled vehicles had been transformed into something that looked far more sinister. "These were recovered from a raid in Afghanistan 18 months ago," the colonel explained. "Improvised explosive devices controlled by modified hobby engines. The person who created these modifications possessed skills very similar to yours, the ability to work with precision parts, to fabricate components that don't exist commercially, to make machines do things they were never designed to do." Sarah studied the images with a mixture of professional curiosity and growing horror. She could see the craftsmanship in the work, the careful engineering that had gone into adapting civilian motors for military purposes. It was the kind of problem-solving she did every day, but twisted toward ends that made her feel sick. The individual responsible for these modifications was killed in the raid, Colonel Matthews continued. "But our intelligence suggests that his associates are looking for someone to replace him." Someone with the right combination of skills, reputation, and accessibility. Accessibility, Sarah repeated flatly. A small-town shop, minimal security, limited law enforcement presence, one of the other men said. Someone who works alone, who might be vulnerable to coercion or financial incentives. Sarah felt a flash of anger cut through her fear. Are you suggesting I'd help terrorists build bombs? I'm suggesting that they might think you would, Colonel Matthews said calmly. Especially if they approached you the right way. A sob story about needing help with a family member's medical equipment. A lucrative contract for what appears to be legitimate work. These people are skilled at manipulation, Miss Chun. They're very good at finding ways to get what they need without their targets realizing what they're really contributing to. The tablet in Sarah's hands felt like it weighed 100 pounds. She scrolled through more images, seeing variations on the same theme: civilian technology perverted for military use. The kind of precise engineering work that she took pride in, transformed into instruments of destruction. What do you want from me? She asked. Your cooperation, Colonel Matthews said. We have reason to believe that contact may be made within the next few weeks. When it happens, we need you to use no immediately. And if I refuse? The colonel's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. Miss Chun, we're not here to threaten you. You're an American citizen, you have rights, and we respect that. But I need you to understand something. The people who are looking for someone like you don't share our respect for individual rights. If they approach you and you're not prepared, if you don't handle the situation correctly, you could find yourself in serious danger. Sarah looked around her shop, seeing it through new eyes. The isolation that had once felt like peaceful solitude now seemed like vulnerability. The reputation she'd built for solving impossible problems had apparently made her a target for people who wanted to use those skills for purposes she could never have imagined. How do you know they'll approach me specifically? She asked. We don't, Colonel Matthews admitted. You're one of several individuals we're monitoring. But your profile fits their requirements almost perfectly: exceptional technical skills, a history of discretion with unusual projects, and a location that would allow them to work without attracting attention. What kind of monitoring are we talking about? Nothing invasive, the colonel assured her. Periodic check-ins, enhanced surveillance of your communications, a security assessment of your property. We're not interested in disrupting your business or your life. We just want to make sure you're safe and that national security isn't compromised. Sarah set the tablet down on her workbench and looked at the three men who had just turned her world upside down. They waited patiently for her response, their expressions neutral but alert. Outside, she could hear the low murmur of radio communications as the other team members maintained their positions. Do I have a choice? She asked. You always have a choice, Colonel Matthews said. But I hope you'll make the right one. Sarah thought about her life in Millbrook, the customers who depended on her, the quiet satisfaction she found in her work. She thought about her parents, who had taught her that every skill came with responsibility, and about the path that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the images on the tablet and the people who would use her abilities to hurt innocent people if given the chance. What exactly would you need me to do? She asked, and Colonel Matthews smiled for the first time since he'd walked into her shop. The next phase of Sarah's life was about to begin, whether she was ready for it or not. The briefing took place 2 days later in a nondescript office building in Austin, an hour's drive from Sarah's shop. Colonel Matthews had insisted on the meeting, explaining that there were details too sensitive to discuss in her workshop. Sarah had closed her shop for the day, telling her customers that she had a family emergency, which wasn't entirely untrue. Considering that her entire life had just become an emergency, the building looked like any other corporate office complex, complete with a lobby full of potted plants and motivational posters about teamwork and excellence. But Sarah noticed the subtle signs that marked it as something more than a typical business center, the security cameras positioned at strategic angles, the receptionist whose eyes held the same alert awareness she'd seen in Colonel Matthews' team, and the way her escort badge required her to be accompanied at all times. The conference room where they met was windowless and sterile, dominated by a large table surrounded by chairs that looked like they'd been selected for function rather than comfort. Colonel Matthews was there, along with 3 new faces, a woman in her 30s with the bearing of a federal agent, an older man whose civilian clothes couldn't quite hide his military background, and a younger woman whose laptop and technical equipment marked her as some kind of specialist. "Miss Chen," Colonel Matthews said as she entered, "thank you for coming. I'd like you to meet Agent Patricia Reeves from the FBI's Counterterrorism Division, Major Tom Harrison from Army Intelligence, and Dr. Lisa Park, our technical analyst." Sarah shook hands with each of them, trying to read their faces for clues about what she was getting herself into. Agent Reeves had the kind of firm handshake that suggested she was accustomed to being underestimated. Major Harrison's grip was brief and professional, and Dr. Park seemed more interested in her laptop screen than in social pleasantries. "Before we begin," Agent Reeves said, producing a stack of documents, "we need you to sign some paperwork. Non-disclosure agreements, security clearances, the usual bureaucratic necessities." Sarah read through the documents carefully, her engineering background having taught her to always examine the fine print. The language was dense with legal terminology, but the basic message was clear: everything she was about to learn was classified, and sharing it with anyone without authorization would result in federal prosecution. "This is really happening," she murmured as she signed the last form. "I'm afraid so," Major Harrison said. "Dr. Park, would you walk Miss Chen through what we know?" Dr. Park looked up from her laptop for the first time, and Sarah was struck by how young she seemed. Despite her title and obvious expertise, she couldn't have been much older than 25. "We've been tracking a network of individuals with connections to several terrorist organizations," Dr. Park began, her voice carrying the slight accent that suggested English wasn't her first language. "The common thread is their interest in what they call adaptive weaponization, taking civilian technology and modifying it for military applications." She turned her laptop so Sarah could see the screen, which displayed a complex diagram showing connections between dozens of names, locations, and organizations. Lines of different colors linked various nodes, creating a web that looked like something from a conspiracy theorist's nightmare. 3 months ago, we intercepted communications suggesting that they were specifically looking for someone with expertise in small motor modification. Dr. Park continued. Someone who could work discreetly, who had a reputation for solving unusual technical problems, and who operated in a location where their activities wouldn't attract attention. Sarah studied the diagram, trying to make sense of the connections. "How many people fit that description?" "More than you might think," Agent Reeves said. "We've identified 47 individuals across the United States who meet their basic criteria. But when we factor in additional requirements, proximity to transportation hubs, history of working on unusual projects, willingness to take on lucrative contracts, the list narrows considerably." "How considerably?" 12 names, Major Harrison sighed. "You're number 3 on that list." Sarah felt her mouth go dry. What happened to numbers 1 and 2? The room fell silent for a moment. Dr. Park closed her laptop and looked directly at Sarah for the first time. Number 1 was an elderly man in Oregon who specialized in vintage aircraft engines, she said quietly. He was approached 6 weeks ago by someone claiming to represent a collector who needed help with a rare motor. 3 days later, his shop burned down. He barely escaped with his life. And number 2? A woman in North Carolina who ran a motorcycle repair business, Agent Reeves said. She disappeared 4 weeks ago. We found her shop cleaned out, her bank accounts emptied, and no trace of where she might have gone. The implications hit Sarah. Like a physical blow. You think they killed her? We think they either killed her or took her somewhere she could work for them without being interrupted, Colonel Matthews said grimly. Either way, she's no longer a threat to their operational security. Sarah pushed back from the table, her hands shaking slightly. And you want me to wait around for these people to show up at my shop? We want to be ready when they do, Major Harrison corrected. Miss Chen, you have advantages that our other potential targets didn't have. You're aware of the threat, you'll have support, and most importantly, you have skills that could help us identify exactly what they're planning. What kind of skills? Dr. Park reopened her laptop and brought up a new set of images. These showed the modified engines again, but now they were annotated with technical specifications and analysis. You see things that other people miss, Dr. Park explained. When Colonel Matthews showed you these images 2 days ago, you immediately understood the engineering principles involved. More importantly, you recognized the craftsmanship. You could probably tell us things about the person who made these modifications that our entire technical team hasn't been able to determine. Sarah looked at the images again, this time with professional interest overriding her fear. The person who did this work was left-handed, she said without thinking. And they learned their trade working on German engines, probably BMW motorcycles. The tool marks are distinctive. The 4 intelligence professionals exchanged glances, and Agent Reeves made a note on her pad. That's exactly the kind of insight we need, Colonel Matthews said. Ms. Chen, we're not asking you to put yourself in danger unnecessarily. We'll have teams monitoring your shop around the clock, and you'll have direct communication with us at all times. But if these people approach you, we need to know what they're planning and how we can stop them. Sarah looked around the table at the 4 faces waiting for her decision. A week ago, her biggest worry had been whether she could finish rebuilding a vintage Mustang engine before her customer's car show. Now she was being asked to become bait in a trap designed to catch international terrorists. If I say yes, she said slowly, what happens to my life, my business, my customers? If everything goes according to plan, you go back to fixing lawn mowers and motorcycles, Major Harrison said. If it doesn't, he shrugged. Ms. Chen, these people are coming whether you cooperate with us or not. The question is whether you want to face them alone or with backup. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The modifications to Sarah's shop were subtle but comprehensive. Over the course of a week, technicians posing as utility workers and contractors made a series of upgrades that would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for them. New security cameras were disguised as light fixtures, motion sensors were hidden in the rafters, and her phone system was upgraded with equipment that could trace and record any incoming calls. Sarah watched the transformation of her workspace with mixed feelings. The technology was impressive. Dr. Park had walked her through a system that could provide real-time analysis of any customer who entered her shop, cross-referencing their faces against international databases and flagging potential threats. But every new piece of equipment was a reminder that her simple life had become impossibly complicated. That the communication device they gave her looked like an ordinary smartphone, but Dr. Park had explained that it was hardened against electronic interference and equipped with satellite communication capabilities that would work even if cellular towers were compromised. A single button would connect her directly to a rapid response team positioned less than 5 minutes from her location. The key is to act natural, Agent Reeves had emphasized during their final briefing. These people are professionals. If they approach you, they'll be watching for signs that you're being monitored or that you suspect their true intentions. You need to be curious but not suspicious, helpful but not eager. Sarah had practiced her responses until they felt natural. If someone approached her with an unusual request, she would ask reasonable questions about the project, discuss pricing and timelines, and suggest that she needed to think about it overnight. That would give the monitoring team time to analyze the situation and determine whether the contact was legitimate or threatening. The waiting was the hardest part. Sarah tried to maintain her normal routine, but every customer who walked through her door made her heart rate spike. She found herself analyzing every face, every accent, every unusual request for signs that this might be the contact they were expecting. Her regular customers noticed the changes, even though she tried to hide her nervousness. Tommy Rodriguez, who brought his lawnmowers to her every spring for tune-ups, commented that she seemed jumpy. Martha Wells, whose ancient pickup truck had been kept running by Sarah's skill for the past decade, asked if everything was all right. "At home. Just been working too hard," Sarah told them, which was partially true. The stress of living under constant surveillance while trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy was exhausting in ways she hadn't anticipated. 2 weeks after the surveillance equipment was installed, Sarah's first suspicious contact arrived. On a Wednesday morning, she was working on a small engine rebuild when she heard a car pull into her parking lot, not unusual in itself, but her enhanced awareness made her glance up from her work. The man who entered her shop was unremarkable in the way that suggested deliberate effort. Average height, average build, clothes that could have been purchased at any department store in America. His accent, when he spoke, carried the faint traces of Eastern Europe that Sarah had been trained to listen for. "Good morning," he said, looking around her shop with apparent interest. "I was told that you are very skilled with motor repairs." "I do my best," Sarah replied, wiping her hands on a shop rag while discreetly pressing the alert button on her hidden communication device. "What can I help you with?" "I have a project that requires someone with very specific expertise," the man said. "Small motors, precision work, perhaps some custom modifications. I was told that you might be willing to take on such work." Sarah's training kicked in. "Ask questions, show interest, but don't seem too eager." "What kind of modifications are we talking about?" The man smiled, but something about the expression made Sarah's skin crawl. "Nothing too complicated. I represent some collectors who work with vintage remote-controlled aircraft. They need someone who can adapt modern electronics to work with older engines. The work pays very well." "How well are we talking?" "Perhaps we could discuss this in more detail," the man said, reaching into his jacket. For a terrifying moment, Sarah thought he was going for a weapon, but he pulled out a business card instead. "My employer would like to meet with you tonight, if possible. There would be a substantial payment just for the consultation." Sarah took the card, noting that it was professionally printed, but provided only a phone number and the name J. Morrison. No address, no company name, no additional contact information. "I appreciate the interest," she said carefully, "but I don't usually take on new projects without knowing more details. Could you tell me a bit more about what specific modifications you're looking for?" The man's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "Miss Chun, I think you will find that this opportunity is worth your time. My employer is prepared to offer you $50,000 for a consultation that would take no more than 2 hours. $50,000. Sarah tried to keep her expression neutral, but the amount was staggering more money than she typically made in 6 months. It was exactly the kind of offer that Agent Reeves had warned her about, designed to overcome reasonable caution with financial temptation. "That's generous," she managed. "But I still need to know more about what kind of work we're discussing." "All will be explained tonight," the man said. "The address is on the back of the card. 8 o'clock. Come alone. Please, my employer values discretion above all else." Sarah flipped the card over and saw an address written in neat handwriting. She recognized the location, an industrial district about 20 miles outside of town, the kind of area where buildings were spaced far apart and neighbors didn't ask questions about unusual activities. "I'll need to check my schedule," she said, playing for time while her mind raced through the protocol she'd been taught. Of course, the man said. But please don't wait too long to decide. My employer has several other candidates he could work with, and he prefers to move quickly on projects like this. The veiled threat was unmistakable. Sarah nodded and tucked the card into her pocket. I'll call you this afternoon. Excellent, the man said. He looked around her shop one more time, his gaze lingering on her tools and equipment. You have impressive facilities here, Miss Chen. I'm sure my employer will be very pleased to work with someone of your obvious capabilities. After he left, Sarah sat on her stool and tried to calm her racing heart. The first contact had been made, exactly as the intelligence team had predicted. Now she had to decide whether she was brave enough to walk into what was almost certainly a trap, trusting that the people who had turned her life upside down would be able to keep her alive. Within minutes of the suspicious visitor's departure, Sarah's shop was quietly surrounded by federal agents. She couldn't see them, but she knew they were there. Colonel Matthews had assured her that the response would be immediate and invisible. Her modified smartphone buzzed with an encrypted message. Package delivered. Meeting requested tonight. Advise. Sarah typed back. Address provided. Industrial District. 8 p.m. Feels like a trap. The response came quickly. Confirmed trap. We're ready, are you? Sarah stared at the question for a long time before typing her reply. Yes. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous energy and careful preparation. Agent Reeves arrived at the shop during lunch, posing as a customer interested in having her motorcycle serviced. While Sarah pretended to examine the bike, Reeves briefed her on the evening's operation. We've identified the location, Reeves said quietly, her voice barely audible over the sound of Sarah's air compressor. It's a warehouse that was supposed to be empty, but our surveillance shows recent activity. 3 vehicles arrived this morning, and thermal imaging suggests at least 6 people inside. 6 people, Sarah repeated, trying to keep her voice steady. The good news is that we'll have teams positioned around the entire perimeter before you arrive, Reeves continued. You'll be wearing a wire, and we'll have eyes on you from multiple angles. The moment things go sideways, we move in. And if they search me for wires, they probably will, Reeves admitted. The device is sewn into your jacket lining, virtually undetectable unless they completely strip search you. And if they try that ... She patted the motorcycle's engine meaningfully. We'll know something's wrong and respond accordingly. That evening, Sarah drove toward the industrial district with her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles ached. The jacket felt unnaturally heavy on her shoulders, weighed down by the knowledge that it contained technology that represented her only lifeline to safety. The warehouse was exactly what she'd expected: hulking metal building, surrounded by empty lots and chain-link fences. A few other structures were scattered around the area, but they all appeared dark and abandoned. The isolation was complete and deliberate. 2 men were waiting for her in the parking lot, both wearing the kind of casual clothing that somehow managed to look threatening. They didn't speak as she approached, but one of them gestured for her to raise her arms while the other conducted a quick but thorough search. Sarah's heart hammered as his hands moved over her jacket, but the hidden device remained undetected. Clean, the searcher announced, and they escorted her toward the warehouse entrance. Inside, the building had been converted into a makeshift workshop that made Sarah's stomach turn. The space was filled with partially assembled devices that she recognized immediately as modified drone engines, their civilian components adapted for purposes that were clearly military in nature. Workbenches were covered with precision tools, electronic components, and partially completed modifications that spoke of expertise and hostile intent. The man who had visited her shop earlier was waiting in the center of the space, but he was no longer alone. 4 other men stood around the perimeter of the workshop, all of them carrying weapons that they made no effort to conceal. In the center of it all sat an older man whose expensive suit and confident bearing marked him as the person in charge. "Ms. Chen," the suited man said, rising from his chair with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you for coming. I am Victor Kozlov, and I have a proposition that I believe will interest you greatly." Sarah recognized the name from her briefings. Kozlov was a former Soviet military engineer who had gone freelance after the collapse of the USSR, selling his expertise to the highest bidder regardless of their intentions. The FBI had been tracking him for years without being able to build a solid case. "I understand you're interested in having some work done," Sarah said, trying to project the combination of curiosity and caution that Agent Reeves had coached her to display. Kozlov gestured to the modified engines surrounding them. "Indeed. As you can see, we have been working on some specialized projects. But we find ourselves in need of someone with more refined skills than our current team possesses." Sarah walked closer to one of the workbenches, genuinely curious despite her fear. The work was sophisticated, but flawed. She could see immediately where the modifications would fail under stress, where the engineering was sound in theory, but problematic in practice. "Interesting approach," she said, pointing to a particularly complex modification. "But you're going to have heat distribution problems with this configuration. The metal fatigue alone will cause failure within 50 operational hours." Kozlov's eyebrows rose. "You can see this just by looking?" "It's what I do," Sarah replied. "May I?" She gestured toward the device. Kozlov nodded, and Sarah picked up the modified engine, turning it over in her hands. The weight distribution was wrong. The balance points had been compromised by the additions, and the cooling system had been completely ignored in favor of adding extra components. "Whoever did this work knows the theory," she said, setting the device back down. "But they don't understand the practical applications. This would work once, maybe twice, before catastrophic failure." "And you could do better?" Sarah looked around the workshop again, taking in the scope of what they were asking her to be part of. "I could do better," she said carefully. "But I'd need to understand exactly what these modifications are supposed to accomplish. And I'd need to know what I'm getting paid for taking on this kind of specialized work." Kozlov smiled genuinely for the first time. "Direct. I appreciate that in a professional. Ms. Chen, what we need are engines that can carry a payload of approximately 2 kilograms over a distance of 50 kilometers with precision guidance capabilities. The current modifications achieve perhaps half that range with questionable reliability." The implications of what he was describing hit Sarah like a physical blow. 2 kilograms was more than enough for a significant explosive device, and 50 kilometers would allow attacks from well beyond any reasonable security perimeter. These weren't hobbyist modifications. They were sophisticated delivery systems for weapons of mass destruction. "That's ambitious," she managed. "The compensation would be equally ambitious," Kozlov said. $500,000 for a working prototype, with additional payments for each subsequent unit you produce. All work would be done here, under secure conditions, with materials and equipment provided. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. $500,000 was more money than she could earn in a decade of legitimate work. But it would also make her complicit in what could be devastating terrorist attacks. "When would you need the prototype completed?" she asked, playing for time while trying to gather as much intelligence as possible. 2 weeks, Kozlov replied. "We have a demonstration plan for potential clients, and we need a system that will perform flawlessly." "Clients?" Kozlov's expression hardened slightly. "Ms. Chen, there are many organizations around the world that find themselves in conflict with technologically superior opponents. We provide them with tools that level the playing field." Sarah nodded, though her stomach churned at the euphemistic language. "I'd need to see all of your current work, understand what resources are available, Maybe take some measurements and run some calculations before I could commit to a timeline. Of course, Kozlov said. But first, I need to know that you're genuinely interested in this opportunity. The work we do here requires absolute discretion and complete commitment. Sarah felt the weight of the moment settling over her. This was the point where she had to convince a room full of armed terrorists that she was willing to help them build weapons that could kill hundreds of innocent people. Everything depended on her ability to project greed and moral flexibility while hiding her revulsion and fear. "Mr. Kozlov," she said, meeting his eyes directly, "I've spent 15 years in a small town fixing lawnmowers for farmers who argue about paying me $50. If you can offer me $500,000 for 2 weeks of work, you have my complete attention and my absolute discretion." Kozlov studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Excellent. Shall we begin?" For the next 3 hours, Sarah was given a comprehensive tour of what amounted to a terrorist engineering laboratory. Kozlov walked her through each workstation, explaining the modifications his team had attempted and the problems they'd encountered. Sarah listened with growing horror and professional fascination, her trained eye immediately identifying flaws in their approach while her conscience recoiled from the implications of their work. The scope of the operation was far larger than she'd imagined. This wasn't a small cell working on a single attack. It was a development and manufacturing facility designed to produce weapons for multiple clients. Kozlov showed her correspondence with groups in 3 different countries, all seeking similar modifications to civilian technology for military purposes. "The beauty of this approach," Kozlov explained as they examined a partially completed guidance system, "is that every component can be purchased legally. Hobby drone parts, commercial GPS units, standard small engines, all perfectly innocent, until they're assembled with the proper expertise." Sarah nodded, making mental notes of everything she saw while maintaining the facade of interested professionalism. The hidden recording device in her jacket was capturing every word, every detail that could be used to shut down this operation and prevent the weapons from reaching their intended targets. "Your current guidance system is the weak point," she observed, studying the electronic components. "You're trying to adapt commercial GPS units, but they're not designed for the kind of precision targeting you need. The signal processing is too slow, and the accuracy degrades significantly at high speeds." "Exactly," Kozlov said, his enthusiasm genuine. "My engineers have been struggling with this problem for months. They understand the individual components, but they lack the intuitive grasp of how mechanical and electronic systems interact. That's why we need someone like you." Sarah picked up one of the modified control units, turning it over in her hands while her mind worked through possible solutions. Despite herself, she found the engineering challenge intellectually engaging. It was the kind of complex problem-solving that had drawn her to mechanical work in the first place. The fact that solving it would enable mass murder made her feel physically sick, but she couldn't help analyzing the technical aspects. "I could fix this," she said quietly, and immediately regretted the words. "I knew you could," Kozlov replied with satisfaction. "Miss Chen, you have a reputation for making the impossible possible. That's exactly what we need." As the tour continued, Sarah began to understand the full scope of what she'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about modifying a few engines. Kozlov's organization was developing an entire weapons system that could be manufactured and deployed anywhere in the world using readily available civilian components. The implications for international security were staggering. "How many units are you planning to produce?" she asked. "That depends on demand," Kozlov said. "Our initial orders are for 50 units, but we expect that number to grow significantly once potential clients see what the technology can accomplish." 50 units. Sarah tried to keep her expression neutral while her mind reeled. Each one could carry enough explosives to level a building or kill dozens of people. In the wrong hands, 50 such weapons could terrorize entire cities. The demonstration you mentioned, Sarah said carefully. What exactly are you planning to show your clients? Kozlov's smile was cold. A live-fire exercise. We have a target selected, an abandoned factory complex about 100 kilometers from here. We'll demonstrate range, accuracy, and payload capacity. Very convincing for prospective buyers. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Even a demonstration against an abandoned building would provide proof of concept that could lead to actual attacks. She had to find a way to prevent it without blowing her cover. Mr. Kozlov, she said, I'm impressed by the scope of your operation, and I'm definitely interested in the compensation you've offered. But I need to be honest with you about timing. The modifications you're asking for, they're not simple tweaks. I'm talking about fundamental redesign of the propulsion, guidance, and payload delivery systems. How much time would you need? Sarah pretended to consider. 6 weeks minimum for a working prototype. Maybe 8 if you want something reliable enough to stake your reputation on. Kozlov's expression darkened. That's not acceptable. Our demonstration is scheduled for 10 days from now. We have clients flying in from 3 continents, specifically to see our capabilities. Then you're going to disappoint them, Sarah said bluntly. Mr. Kozlov, you asked me here because your current modifications don't work reliably. Rushing a redesign isn't going to solve that problem. It's going to make it worse. For a moment, tension filled the warehouse as Kozlov weighed his options. Sarah could see his associates shifting nervously, their hands moving closer to their weapons. She forced herself to remain calm, knowing that showing fear now could be fatal. Perhaps, Kozlov said slowly, we could proceed with the current design for the demonstration, with the understanding that you would provide improved versions for actual deployment. Sarah shook her head. That would be a mistake. If your demonstration fails, and it will, based on what I've seen, you'll lose credibility with your clients. Better to delay and show them something that actually works. The delay is not possible, Kozlov said firmly. Too many arrangements have been made. Too much money has been invested. We proceed as scheduled. Sarah realized she was at a crucial decision point. She could continue trying to delay the demonstration, but that would likely make Kozlov suspicious of her motives. Or she could agree to help with the current flawed design, knowing that its failure might actually serve to discredit the entire program. All right, she said finally. I can't completely redesign your systems in 10 days, but I might be able to make enough improvements to get you through your demonstration. After that, we can work on developing something more reliable for actual deployment. Kozlov nodded approvingly. Now you're thinking like a professional. What would you need to begin work immediately? Sarah looked around the workshop, calculating what she would need to appear busy while actually sabotaging their efforts. Access to your technical specifications, a complete inventory of available components, and a workspace where I can concentrate without interruption. I do my best work when I'm not being watched over my shoulder. Of course, Kozlov said. We have a private workshop area that should meet your needs. My associate will show you the facilities and provide whatever resources you require. As they walked toward the back of the warehouse, Sarah caught sight of a wall-mounted calendar marked with dates and locations. Her blood ran cold as she recognized some of the targets marked for the weeks following the demonstration: government buildings, international airports, and civilian infrastructure in major cities around the world. This wasn't just about building weapons for other people to use. Kozlov's organization had their own attack schedule planned, and they intended to use Sarah's improvements to ensure their success. The scope of the planned violence was beyond anything she had imagined. She had 10 days to find a way to stop them all. Sarah's private workspace turned out to be a converted office space in the back corner of the warehouse, equipped with basic tools and a workbench that had seen better decades. More importantly, it was positioned where she could observe most of the main workshop area. while appearing to focus on her assigned tasks. The two-way mirror that Kozlov probably thought was subtle told her that privacy was an illusion, but at least she had some space to think. Her first priority was establishing a communication routine that wouldn't arouse suspicion. The recording device in her jacket was capturing everything, but she needed a way to provide real-time intelligence to the team monitoring her. Agent Reeves had briefed her on a system of coded text messages that would appear to be routine business communications to anyone monitoring her phone. Inventory complete. She texted to a number that appeared to be a parts supplier. Project more complex than expected. Additional consultation required. The coded message would tell her handlers that she had successfully infiltrated the operation, that the threat was larger than anticipated, and that she needed immediate guidance on how to proceed. The response came within minutes, disguised as a supplier's reply about delivery schedules. Understood. Proceed with scheduled timeline. Additional support standing by. Sarah interpreted the message correctly. Maintain her cover, stay on schedule. With the demonstration, and trust that backup plans were being implemented. But she still felt profoundly alone in a room full of people who would kill her without hesitation if they discovered her true identity. Over the next 3 days, Sarah established a routine that allowed her to gather intelligence while maintaining the appearance of working on the weapons modifications. She would arrive at the warehouse each morning at 8, spend the day apparently focused on improving the guidance systems, and leave each evening with progress reports for KOZLOV. In reality, she was conducting the most elaborate act of sabotage in her career. Every modification she made was designed to look impressive while ensuring system failure at crucial moments. She adjusted fuel mixture ratios to create engine instability, introduced subtle flaws in the guidance programming that would cause navigation errors, and weakened key structural components in ways that wouldn't be apparent until the systems were under operational stress. The work required all of her technical expertise applied in reverse. Instead of solving problems, she was creating them in ways that would appear accidental. It was exhausting and nerve-wracking, requiring her to constantly monitor her own work to ensure that her sabotage remained undetectable. Kozlov visited her workspace regularly, checking on her progress and asking detailed questions about her modifications. Sarah had to provide convincing explanations for every change she made, describing improvements while actually describing the sabotage she was implementing. The fuel injection system was completely wrong, she told him on the 3rd day, gesturing to an engine she had just finished improving. I've recalibrated the mixture to provide optimal thrust-to-weight ratio. You should see significant performance improvements. What she had actually done was create a fuel mixture that would burn too hot under sustained operation, causing the engine to seize after approximately 15 minutes of flight time. Long enough to pass initial testing, but guaranteed to fail during the actual demonstration. Excellent, Kozlov said, examining her work with obvious satisfaction. And the guidance system? I've upgraded the signal processing algorithms, Sarah replied, showing him lines of code on her laptop screen. The new system will be much more responsive to course corrections and target acquisition. The code she'd written would actually introduce a random navigation error that would compound over distance, ensuring that any weapon using her modifications would miss its target by increasingly wide margins the farther it traveled. But Sarah's sabotage efforts were complicated by a growing awareness that she wasn't the only one in the warehouse with hidden motives. On her 4th day, she noticed one of Kozlov's associates, a quiet man named Dmitri, who worked on the electronic systems making modifications that seemed inconsistent with the project's stated goals, while pretending to adjust a component on her workbench. Sarah observed Dmitri installing what appeared to be additional communication equipment in several of the weapons. The modifications were subtle and expertly done, but they served no obvious purpose in the guidance system she'd been asked to improve. That evening, Sarah sent another coded message, Quality control reveals additional features not in original specifications. Recommend inspection of all units before delivery. The response was immediate. Noted. Continue monitoring. Documentation essential. Sarah realized that she might not be the only person in the warehouse working under false pretenses. The possibility that Dmitry was also an undercover operative, or that he was implementing his own agenda separate from Kozlov's, added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. Her suspicions were confirmed the next morning when she arrived early and caught Dmitry working alone in the main workshop area. He was installing small devices that looked like backup communication systems, but Sarah's engineering eye recognized them as something else entirely remote. Detonation triggers. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Dmitry wasn't just modifying the weapons. He was turning them into suicide devices that could be triggered remotely. Any group that purchased these systems would be buying their own destruction along with their attack capability. Sarah pretended not to notice what Dmitry was doing, but her mind raced through the possibilities. Was he working for a rival organization, a government agency? Or was this part of Kozlov's plan all along: sell weapons to terrorist groups, then eliminate the buyers to prevent them from revealing their source? As she settled into her workspace for another day of carefully orchestrated sabotage, Sarah realized that the warehouse contained at least 3 different agendas: Kozlov's plan to demonstrate and sell weapons, her mission to ensure the systems failed, and Dmitry's apparent intent to eliminate anyone who actually used them. The question was whether all 3 plans could coexist, or whether the conflicting objectives would expose everyone involved before the demonstration could be stopped. Was running out, and Sarah was no longer certain who, if anyone, she could trust. By the 6th day, the atmosphere in the warehouse had become noticeably tense. Kozlov was feeling the pressure of the approaching demonstration, and his associates were displaying the kind of nervous energy that comes from working on a high-stakes project with an immovable deadline. Sarah used the general anxiety to her advantage, making increasingly frequent requests for specialized components and tools that required trips to suppliers in town. Each trip was actually a brief opportunity to communicate with her handlers without the risk of electronic surveillance. Agent Reeves had established a system where Sarah would leave coded notes in a dead drop at a rest stop halfway between the warehouse and Millbrook. The messages were disguised as shopping lists, but they contained detailed intelligence about the weapons development, the planned demonstration, and Sarah's growing concerns about Dmitry's modifications. Need milk, bread, 12 eggs, she wrote on her most recent note. Also butter, salt, and those special crackers from the international aisle. Don't forget the cleaning supplies, the heavy-duty kind that removes everything. Translated, the message reported 12 completed weapons, described Dmitry's additional modifications, and warned that the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. The response, left in the same location an hour later, was equally cryptic, but reassuring. Groceries ordered. Delivery scheduled for Saturday morning. Special cleaning crew standing by. Saturday was the day of the demonstration. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror, knowing that federal agents would be moving in to shut down the operation. But she also knew that the next 3 days would be the most dangerous of her life. Any mistake, any sign that she wasn't completely committed to the project, could result in her death. On the 7th day, Kozlov announced that they would be moving to the demonstration site for final preparations. The abandoned factory complex he'd mentioned turned out to be a former automotive plant, about 2 hours' drive from the warehouse. The facility had been closed for over a decade, but it still contained the kind of large-scale industrial equipment that would provide an impressive target for their weapons test. Sarah rode in Kozlov's vehicle, along with Dmitry and 2 other associates. The conversation during the drive revealed details about the demonstration that made her blood run cold. Kozlov wasn't just planning to show his clients that the weapons could destroy a building. He was planning a series of increasingly complex attacks that would demonstrate precision targeting, payload delivery, and coordinated assault capabilities. The first wave will take out the main electrical systems, Kozlov explained, pointing to a tablet displaying aerial photographs of the factory complex. The second wave will breach the primary structures, and the third wave will demonstrate payload delivery to specific interior targets. Sarah realized that this wasn't just a demonstration of weapons capability, it was a rehearsal for actual terrorist attacks. Every aspect of the test was designed to prove that Kozlov's modified drones could penetrate defensive perimeters, disable infrastructure, and deliver lethal payloads with surgical precision. Impressive, she managed, though her mouth felt dry. Your clients should be very satisfied with this demonstration. They better be, Kozlov replied grimly. We have invested considerable resources in this project, and we need confirmed orders to justify the expense. At the factory complex, Sarah was given a final opportunity to inspect and adjust the weapons before the demonstration. She used the time to make subtle additional modifications to her sabotage, ensuring that the systems would fail in spectacular and obvious ways. But she was troubled by the discovery that Dmitri had also made last-minute changes to several units, and she couldn't determine whether his modifications would interfere with her own sabotage efforts. The clients began arriving that evening, representatives from organizations that Sarah recognized from FBI wanted lists and international terrorism reports. Seeing them in person, discussing the weapons as if they were ordinary commercial products, drove home the reality of what she was helping to prevent. These people weren't abstract threats. They were real individuals planning real attacks against real victims. Kozlov introduced her to several of the clients as his technical consultant, and Sarah had to shake hands with people she knew were responsible for bombings, assassinations, and other attacks around the world. She smiled and nodded as they complimented her work, all while knowing that her sabotage would hopefully prevent them from acquiring the weapons they'd come to purchase. Your reputation precedes you, Miss Chen, said a man who introduced himself only as Mr. Abdul. Sarah recognized him from intelligence briefings as a key figure in a group responsible for dozens of civilian deaths. Kozlov tells us that your modifications have solved the reliability problems that plague earlier versions. I do my best work under pressure, Sarah replied. The irony of the statement lost on everyone except herself. That night as Sarah lay in the small bedroom they'd given her in the factory's converted office building, she reflected on how drastically her life had changed. 2 weeks ago, her biggest concern had been meeting a delivery deadline for a vintage motorcycle restoration. Now she was sleeping in a terrorist compound, surrounded by weapons she'd helped sabotage, waiting for federal agents to launch an assault that could easily result in her death. She thought about her parents, about the customers who depended on her shop, about the quiet life she'd built in Millbrook. All of it seemed impossibly distant from where she found herself now. But she also thought about the attacks that would be prevented if her mission succeeded, about the innocent people who would live because she'd found the courage to do what needed to be done. Tomorrow would bring the demonstration, the culmination of everything she'd worked toward and feared. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to rest, knowing that the next day would determine whether she lived to return to her old life or died in service of preventing unimaginable violence. Either way, there was no turning back now. Dawn broke gray and cold over the abandoned factory complex, matching Sarah's mood as she prepared for what she hoped would be the final day of her undercover mission. The demonstration was scheduled to begin at 10 a.m., giving Kozlov's team time for final preparations and allowing the clients to observe the weapons systems in optimal lighting conditions. Sarah had been awake since 5, running through mental checklists of all the sabotage she'd implemented over the past week. Every system had been compromised in ways that should ensure spectacular failures, but the complexity of the weapons and the number of variables involved meant that she couldn't be absolutely certain her sabotage would be effective. The possibility that some of the weapons might actually work as intended terrified her almost as much as the prospect of being discovered. Kozlov was in an excellent mood, chatting enthusiastically with his clients about the technical specifications of the weapons and the potential applications for their organizations. Sarah watched him explain the modifications she'd made, describing improvements while she knew he was actually describing carefully engineered failures. "Miss Chen has solved our most persistent problems," Kozlov told a group of buyers. "Range, accuracy, payload capacity, everything has been optimized for maximum effectiveness." Sarah nodded and smiled, playing her role while mentally preparing for whatever was about to happen. According to her last communication with Agent Reeves, federal teams were positioned around the perimeter of the complex, waiting for the weapons testing to begin before moving in. The plan was to allow the demonstration to proceed just long enough to gather evidence of Kozlov's criminal intent, then shut down the operation before any actual damage could be done. But Sarah was worried about variables that the federal agents might not have considered. Dimitri's mysterious modifications could affect the timing of everything, and there was always the possibility that her sabotage might not work as planned. If even one of the weapons performed as designed, it could provide enough proof of concept to convince the buyers to place orders for hundreds more. At 9:30, the weapons were loaded onto mobile launchers positioned around the factory complex. Sarah watched nervously as Kozlov's technicians conducted final system checks, looking for any sign that her sabotage had been discovered. But the pre-flight diagnostics all showed green lights. Her modifications were subtle enough to pass initial testing while still ensuring failure under operational conditions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kozlov announced to the assembled clients, "we are ready to begin our demonstration. What you are about to see represents the future of asymmetric warfare precision weapons that can be manufactured anywhere, deployed by anyone, and targeted with surgical accuracy." The first weapon launched at exactly 10 a.m., streaking toward its target with what appeared to be perfect precision. Sarah held her breath, counting the seconds until her sabotage should take effect. At 43 seconds into the flight, just as the weapon should have been making its final approach to the target, the engine seized exactly as she'd planned. The drone crashed into an empty field half a kilometer short of its intended target. Kozlov's expression shifted from confidence to confusion to anger in the span of seconds. "Technical malfunction," he announced to his clients. "We'll proceed with the second unit." The second weapon launched 2 minutes later, and this time Sarah's fuel mixture sabotage worked even better than she'd hoped. The engine caught fire 30 seconds into flight, creating a spectacular fireball that crashed dramatically in full view of the assembled buyers. "Another malfunction," Kozlov said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Perhaps we should," he was interrupted by the sound of helicopters approaching from multiple directions. Sarah felt a surge of relief and terror as she recognized the distinctive sound of military aircraft. The federal response team was moving in, right on schedule. "Everyone, remain calm," Kozlov shouted, but his associates were already drawing weapons and taking defensive positions. The buyers scattered in panic, diving for cover behind vehicles and equipment. Sarah threw herself behind a concrete barrier as gunfire erupted across the factory complex. The sound of automatic weapons mixed with the roar of helicopters and the shouted commands of federal agents. She could hear Kozlov screaming orders to his men, demanding that they fight their way out of what had suddenly become a well-orchestrated trap. Through the chaos, Sarah spotted Dimitri moving toward the remaining weapons with what looked like a remote detonation device. She realized with horror that he intended to trigger all of the remaining units simultaneously, potentially creating enough destruction to eliminate evidence and kill everyone in the immediate area. Without thinking, Sarah broke cover and sprinted toward Dimitri, tackling him just as he pressed the activation button on his device. They crashed to the ground together, the detonator skittering across the concrete and coming to rest near one of the weapons launchers. "You don't understand," Dmitri gasped, blood streaming from his nose where Sarah's elbow had connected. "I'm trying to prevent—" His words were cut off by the arrival of federal agents, who surrounded them both with weapons drawn. Sarah raised her hands, shouting her identification code over the sound of continuing gunfire. "Agent Reeves," she called. "It's Sarah Chen. I'm the asset." Agent Reeves appeared at her side, helping her to her feet while other agents secured Dmitri. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Sarah replied, though she was shaking so badly she could barely stand. "But that man Dmitri, he was trying to detonate all the remaining weapons." "I think he might be federal agent," Reeves confirmed. "ATF, working the same case from a different angle. You probably saved his life by stopping him from destroying evidence we need for prosecution." Sarah looked around at the scene of controlled chaos. Federal agents arresting Kozlov's associates, paramedics treating wounded buyers, and explosive ordnance teams securing the remaining weapons. It was over. The demonstration had been stopped, the weapons had been confiscated, and a major terrorist threat had been neutralized. But as Sarah watched Kozlov being led away in handcuffs, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just one small victory in a much larger war. Somewhere else, other mechanics were probably being approached by other criminals with other schemes to turn civilian technology into instruments of terror. For now, though, it was enough to know that she had done her part. Sarah Chen, small-town mechanic, had helped prevent what could have been devastating attacks around the world. As Agent Reeves led her toward the evacuation helicopters, Sarah allowed herself to think about returning to her shop, her customers, and her quiet life in Millbrook. The motor whisperer was ready to go home. The debriefing process took 3 days and felt longer than the entire undercover operation. Sarah found herself in a secure facility outside of Austin, answering the same questions over and over again for different agencies, each wanting to understand exactly how she'd infiltrated Kozlov's organization and what intelligence she'd gathered. Agent Reeves sat in on most of the sessions, occasionally steering the conversation when Sarah became overwhelmed by the technical questions or the implications of what she'd helped prevent. The scope of Kozlov's network, it turned out, was even larger than anyone had initially suspected. The intelligence Sarah had gathered led to simultaneous raids in 4 different countries, resulting in the arrest of over 30 individuals and the seizure of enough modified weapons to supply several major terrorist attacks. "You realize," Colonel Matthews said during one of their sessions, "that you've probably saved hundreds of lives, maybe thousands." Sarah nodded, though the weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any satisfaction she might have derived from the accomplishment. "What happens now?" "Now you go home," Agent Reeves said. "Back to your shop, back to your life. The cover story is that you were consulting on a classified project for the Department of Defense, which is technically true. Anyone who asks too many questions will be politely redirected to other topics." "And Kozlov?" "Facing multiple life sentences," Colonel Matthews replied with satisfaction, "along with most of his associates. The buyers we captured are being processed through various international agreements, and the weapons themselves are being studied to prevent similar modifications in the future." Sarah felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by a nagging concern. What about other networks, other people like Kozlov? Agent Reeves and Colonel Matthews exchanged glances. "There will always be others," Reeves admitted. "But what you've helped us learn about their methods, their recruitment techniques, their operational security, all of that intelligence makes it much easier to identify and stop similar operations in the future. We'd like to keep you on as a consultant," Colonel Matthews added. "Not undercover work," he clarified quickly, seeing Sarah's expression. "Technical analysis, helping us understand how civilian technology might be weaponized, training other agents to recognize the signs of these kinds of modifications." Sarah considered the offer. The work would be important, and the compensation would be substantial. But she thought about her shop, her customers, the quiet satisfaction of fixing engines that were used for legitimate purposes. "I appreciate the offer," she said finally, "but I think I've had enough excitement for one lifetime. I just want to go back to fixing lawn mowers." Colonel Matthews smiled. "I understand. But Ms. Chen, if you ever change your mind, or if you notice anything unusual in your line of work, please don't hesitate to contact us. You've proven yourself to be exceptionally valuable to national security." The drive back to Millbrook felt surreal. Sarah had been gone for less than 2 weeks, but it seemed like months since she'd seen the familiar landscape of small farms and rural businesses. Her shop looked exactly as she'd left it, though she noticed that the security modifications were still in place, hidden cameras and communication equipment that she could now spot easily after her training. Her first customer was Tommy Rodriguez, who brought in his lawnmower for the annual spring tune-up just as if nothing had happened. "Where have you been, Sarah?" Tommy asked. "Tried to bring this in last week, but you had a sign saying you were doing some government consulting work." "Just a short-term project," Sarah replied, lifting the hood of his mower and breathing in the familiar smell of oil and grass clippings. "Nothing too exciting." As she worked on Tommy's mower, Sarah felt the tension of the past weeks beginning to drain away. This was her world-honest work, straightforward problems, customers who trusted her to fix their machines and get them back to their lives. The complexity of international terrorism and weapons modification seemed impossibly distant from the simple satisfaction of cleaning a carburetor and adjusting a throttle cable. But Sarah had been changed by her experience in ways that she was only beginning to understand. She found herself looking at every customer with new eyes, analyzing their requests for signs of anything unusual. When a stranger showed up asking about modifications to a small engine, Sarah's first instinct was to reach for the emergency communication device that Agent Reeves had insisted she keep. The stranger turned out to be a legitimate customer who needed help adapting an engine for a vintage go-kart. But Sarah realized that she would never again be able to approach her work with the same innocent assumption that everyone who walked through her door had honest intentions. "You seem different," Martha Wells observed when she brought in her ancient pickup truck for its monthly checkup. "More alert, I guess, like you're listening for something." Sarah smiled as she connected her diagnostic equipment to Martha's truck. "Maybe I'm just getting older and more careful about my work." But Martha's observation was accurate. Sarah had been changed by her experience in ways that went beyond increased vigilance. She found herself appreciating the simple honesty of her regular customers, the straightforward nature of mechanical problems, and the satisfaction of work that helped people rather than harmed them. 3 weeks after returning to Millbrook, Sarah received a package with no return address. Inside was a simple certificate from the Department of Defense, thanking her for her exceptional service in support of national security operations. There was also a letter from Agent Reeves, written on plain stationery with no official letterhead. "Sarah." The letter read, "I wanted you to know that the intelligence you gathered has already been used to prevent 2 other weapons development operations. Your courage and technical expertise have quite literally saved lives. I hope you find peace in your return to normal life, but please know that your country is grateful for your service." Sarah folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer, next to her business license and insurance papers. It seemed appropriate somehow documentation of the 2 sides of her professional life, the ordinary and the extraordinary. As the months passed, Sarah settled back into her routine. But she never forgot the lessons she'd learned. She paid more attention to her customers, asked more questions about unusual requests, and maintained the communication protocols that Agent Reeves had established. She never had occasion to use them, but knowing they were there provided a sense of security that she hadn't realized she needed. The hidden surveillance Equipment gradually disappeared from her shop, removed by technicians who appeared to be routine maintenance workers. But Sarah knew that she would never again be completely invisible to the intelligence agencies that had recruited her. She was now part of an informal network of civilian specialists who could be called upon if similar situations arose. That knowledge was both comforting and troubling. Sarah took pride in knowing that she had served her country in a meaningful way, but she also worried about the implications of a world where small-town mechanics might be recruited as intelligence assets. It suggested a level of ongoing threat that she preferred not to think about too deeply. 6 months after the Kozlov operation, Sarah's life had largely returned to normal, but she found herself changed in subtle ways that her customers and friends couldn't quite identify. She was more observant, more cautious about taking on unusual projects, and more appreciative of the simple, honest work that made up the majority of her business. The reputation that had once made her a target for terrorists now brought her a different kind of attention. Word had somehow spread through the mechanic community that Sarah had done some kind of classified consulting work for the government, and she began receiving referrals from other shops for particularly challenging problems. Sarah Chen's "the one you want to talk to" became a common refrain among mechanics across Texas. If she can't fix it, it can't be fixed. Sarah didn't mind the increased business, but she was careful to screen new customers more thoroughly than she had in the past. Every unusual request was analyzed not just for its technical challenges, but for any signs that it might be connected to activities that could threaten national security. Most of the time, her heightened awareness proved unnecessary. The man who wanted her to modify a small engine for his model airplane was genuinely building a scale replica of a World War II fighter. The woman who needed help adapting a motorcycle engine for an art installation was exactly what she claimed to be. The college student who brought in a drone motor that had been damaged in a crash was simply trying to salvage his expensive hobby equipment. But occasionally, Sarah's training proved valuable in ways that had nothing to do with international terrorism. When a nervous young man brought in a motorcycle that had been modified in ways that didn't make technical sense, Sarah's questions revealed that the bike had been stolen and poorly disguised. Her call to local law enforcement resulted in the recovery of several stolen motorcycles and the arrest of a theft ring that had been operating across 3 counties. "How did you know?" the investigating officer asked after the arrests were made. "The modifications were all wrong," Sarah explained. Someone had changed the engine configuration in ways that would actually reduce performance. The only reason to do that would be to make the bike harder to identify, not to make it run better. The officer nodded, though Sarah could tell he didn't fully understand the technical details. "Well, whatever made you suspicious, it helped us close a case we'd been working on for months." Sarah didn't mention that her suspicions had been honed by weeks of training in recognizing when technical work might be serving purposes other than those claimed by the customer. Some skills she was learning had applications far beyond their original intent. As her first year post-Kozlov progressed, Sarah began to understand that her experience had fundamentally changed her relationship with her work. She could never again approach a technical problem with pure innocence. Never again assume that every customer was exactly what they appeared to be. But rather than making her paranoid or cynical, the experience had made her more thoughtful and deliberate in her approach to problem solving. She found herself asking better questions, not just about the technical aspects of a job, but about the context and intended use of whatever she was being asked to fix or modify. This deeper level of engagement with her customers' needs made her a better mechanic, even as it reflected her heightened awareness of potential security concerns. Sarah also discovered that her experience had given her a new perspective on the weaker relationship between civilian technology and national security. She began following news about export controls on dual-use technology, about efforts to prevent the proliferation of weapons-related knowledge, and about the ongoing challenge of balancing legitimate commercial activity with security concerns. "It's everywhere once you start looking for it," she told Agent Reeves during one of their quarterly check-in calls. "The line between civilian and military technology isn't as clear as most people think. That's exactly why people like you are so valuable," Reeves replied. "You understand both sides of that equation, the legitimate uses and the potential for abuse." These conversations with Agent Reeves had become an important part of Sarah's routine. They provided an outlet for discussing aspects of her work that she couldn't share with anyone else, and they helped her process the ongoing psychological effects of her undercover experience. "Do you ever regret getting involved?" Reeves asked. During one of their calls, Sarah considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "I regret that it was necessary, and I regret that there are people in the world who would use my skills to hurt innocent people, but I don't regret helping to stop them." "And if a similar situation arose again?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "I hope it doesn't," she said. "But if it does, and if you need my help, I'll be here." It was a commitment that Sarah made not just to Agent Reeves, but to herself. She had learned that her skills carried responsibilities beyond the simple fixing of engines, and she was prepared to accept those responsibilities if circumstances required it. But for now, she was content to be Sarah Chen, small-town mechanic, fixing lawn mowers and motorcycles for customers who trusted her expertise and her integrity. It was honest work, important work, and work that served her community in ways that were immediate and tangible. The hidden complexity of her experience with Kozlov remained largely invisible to her neighbors in Millbrook, but it informed every aspect of how she approached her profession and her life. 1 year after the Kozlov operation, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her shop. She looked up from a carburetor rebuild to see Colonel Matthews standing in her doorway, but this time he was alone and wearing civilian clothes rather than tactical gear. "Colonel," Sarah said, wiping her hands on a shop rag, "this is a surprise." "Actually, it's just Tom now," he replied with a smile. "I retired from active duty last month. I wanted to stop by and thank you personally for what you did." Sarah gestured to a chair beside her workbench. "How did it turn out? The prosecution, I mean." "Better than we hoped," Matthews said, settling into the chair with the careful movements of someone whose military career had taken a physical toll. "Kozlov pled guilty to avoid the death penalty. He's serving multiple life sentences, and his testimony helped us roll up networks in 6 different countries. And the buyers? Most of them are either in prison or dead," Matthews said matter-of-factly. "The intelligence you helped us gather led to operations that dismantled their organizations pretty thoroughly." Sarah nodded, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She was glad that the threat had been neutralized, but the human cost of the entire operation, even when the casualties were people who had intended to commit mass murder, still weighed on her conscience. "There's something else," Matthews continued. "The techniques you helped us develop for identifying weaponized civilian technology have been incorporated into training programs for law enforcement and intelligence agencies worldwide. Your contribution to national security extends far beyond that single operation." "I just did what needed to be done," Sarah said. "That's what makes someone a hero," Matthews replied. "Not seeking out danger or glory, but stepping up when circumstances require it." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the label, but she understood what Matthews was trying to tell her. Her actions had had consequences that extended far beyond her small shop in Millbrook, and those consequences had saved lives around the world. After Matthews left, Sarah returned to her work with a renewed sense of purpose. She had always taken pride in her ability to fix things that others couldn't, but now she understood that her skills were part of a larger network of capabilities that helped protect innocent people from those who would do them harm. The work itself hadn't changed. She still spent her days diagnosing engine problems, fabricating replacement parts, and solving the mechanical puzzles that her customers brought her. But her understanding of why that work mattered had deepened considerably. As she locked up her shop that evening, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. A week ago, no, it seemed like a lifetime ago, she had been a simple small-town mechanic whose biggest worry was meeting delivery deadlines. The woman who locked up Chun's motor repair that night was someone who had seen the worst of human nature and had found the courage to stand against it. She thought about her parents, who had taught her that every skill came with responsibility. They would have been proud of how she had used her abilities in service of something larger than herself, even though they would never know the details of what she had accomplished. Sarah also thought about her customers. Tommy Rodriguez with his annual lawnmower tune-ups, Martha Wells with her ancient pickup truck, the dozens of farmers and mechanics and weekend warriors who depended on her expertise to keep their machines running. They were the reason she had been willing to risk everything. The faces that had given her courage when she was surrounded by people who would have killed her without hesitation. The quiet streets of Millbrook stretched out before her as she walked to her truck, and Sarah felt a deep appreciation for the ordinary safety of small-town life. Most of her neighbors would never know how close they had come to living in a world where terrorist attacks were routine and civilian technology was routinely weaponized against innocent targets. That was as it should be. The whole point of her mission had been to preserve the kind of world where people could live their lives without constantly looking over their shoulders for threats, where a mechanic could fix engines without wondering whether her work might be used to hurt people, where the biggest concern in most people's lives was whether their lawnmower would start when they needed it. Sarah climbed into her truck and started the engine, listening automatically to the familiar sounds that told her everything was running properly. Tomorrow would bring new customers with new problems to solve, and she would approach each challenge with the same dedication to excellence that had defined her career from the beginning. But she would also approach each day with the knowledge that her ordinary work was part of something extraordinary, a vast network of people committed to protecting the innocent and preserving the kind of world where small-town mechanics could fix motors in peace. The motor whisperer drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, content in the knowledge that she had helped keep the world safe for the simple, honest work that gave her life meaning. And if the situation ever arose again, if her country needed her skills in service of a greater good, Sarah Chen would be ready. After all, she had always been someone who could make the impossible possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.